The NEXUS Conference 2003 was held at the Krasnopolski Hotel Amsterdam, the Netherlands.
I would like to introduce myself. My name is Duncan Rhodes. I'm the editor of NEXUS magazine. I assume most people here read the magazine. Thank you all very much, I should say.
Duncan Rhodes, editor of NEXUS magazine, introduced the speakers. The international audience then heard groundbreaking presentations from Lloyd Pye, the author of Everything You Know Is Wrong, Part 1, Human Origins.
Completely reconfigured from the human norm, completely, and the bone itself, and this is key, the bone itself is no longer normal human bone.
Jan Lamprecht from South Africa, the author of a groundbreaking book, Hollow Planets.
The explanation when you use the hollow earth idea is actually a smoother one. You don't have to assume many different things.
David Hatcher Childress, author and owner of Adventures Unlimited Press.
Throughout the world, there has been this purposeful destruction of knowledge to keep us from knowing what it was like in the past.
Michael Cremo, author of the classic Forbidden Archaeology.
The main reason why we don't hear about them is that these discoveries contradict, the Darwinian theory of evolution.
Aleksander Milinkovic from Serbia, discussing the work and influences on Nikola Tesla.
The other serious question is, what happened to his Nobel Prize?
Laurence Gardner from Britain. His new book, Lost Secrets of the Sacred Ark, looks into the influence of white powder gold.
This material, which they're calling stardust, they're now saying could actually be the very key they're looking for to give us a clue to the origin of the life force on this planet.
Al Bielek, one of the few to survive the 1943 Philadelphia experiment.
That first test worked perfectly because it was Tesla equipment and Tesla was still in the project. He still was running it.
Mike Ruppert, retired LAPD drug agent, now investigating the war on terror.
The most important thing to do now is that we have to take the hands of the maniacs who are controlling the levers of world politics off of the levers of control.
Jim Marrs, best-selling author, his current book, Rule by Secrecy, Secret Societies Through the Ages.
And I think there may be knowledge there or even ancient artifacts that could give great power to whoever controls and owns them.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for coming today. It's good to see you all here. Duncan took up a lot of what my initial remarks were going to be, so you know basically what the story is. I would mention that in my book, I signed the copies out there, and for those that you get it, for those of you who get it, there will be an inscription that I think also, as well as the title, could stand for the motto of the conference. It's called Nil Carborundum. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's barracks room Latin for never let the bastards grind you down. There's a guy shaking, yeah, I know what that means. So I think that fits for all of us. We're all up against it as we pursue our various careers in this field. I'm going to start by mentioning, following up on what Duncan said, there is a battle for the hearts and minds of everybody here and everybody around the world between people who are called creationists collectively, and they are the ones who believe that God did it all, and that's their answer for all the questions. Then there are the materialists, the rationalists, the naturalists, the Darwinists. I just call them Darwinists because you can call them anything, but they all believe, as Duncan said, that everything formed out of the natural, biological, and chemical elements of the earth, everything, and that everything can be explained within the confines of that and the confines of our three dimensions. And that war is what it is, continues such that they have staked out diametrically opposed positions, and you're basically either for one or for the other, and they leave no room in the middle ground. But there is plenty of room in the middle ground, and I'm one of the few people that I'm aware who plows that ground. And what I'm going to do today is take you on a brief tour of the areas that I've investigated. And we'll go through some of the evidence that I think strongly indicates that the truth is going to lie in that middle ground rather than in either of the current creationist or Darwinist camps. I believe that they're both fundamentally wrong. Okay, with that, let's start. First slide. Okay, this is what Duncan was saying, what we're all taught. And indeed, I was taught this, and probably a lot of you were. Life begins with simple elements, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, forming themselves into simple compounds, carbon monoxide, water, formaldehyde, ammonia. And this is basically the real world. But somehow they find themselves on a magical chemical yellow brick road of some kind, and they form in these more complex things like fatty acids, purines, amino acids, nucleotide sugars, things that don't really happen in real life without catalytic help. Then they form even more complex things, lipids, DNA, protein, which really don't happen in real life except for the lipids sometimes. And then all together they somehow magically form the lipids somehow, which won't clump together on water hardly without a lot of catalytic help. They somehow form themselves into a double-layer membrane of the first living thing, whatever that was. That membrane, when it was collecting itself, somehow knew to gather up some DNA to make it be able to perform life functions, and the DNA somehow knew how to create proteins, which is what it does. And not only that, the cell knew how to, the living thing, whatever it was, knew how to let, the membrane knew how to let material in so that it could form the proteins and the energy, and knew how to let the waste out, and it knew how, somehow, magically, to divide itself and to keep reproducing itself ad infinitum. It is complexity piled on complexity, and whether you want to take the argument that it occurred very slowly over time or very quickly by being struck by a lightning bolt, it all had to happen. It all had to put itself together that way. What are the odds of that? Next slide. The odds are of a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and correctly assembling a Boeing 747. It did not happen. It could not happen. It is an impossibility. In natural, materialistic, Darwinistic terms, it just couldn't happen. And yet, here I stand talking to you, and there you sit listening to me. So it's clear that something happened. Something happened. And what that is absolutely unknown at this point. But when it is known, it is going to appear to all of us here today like nothing less than a supernatural event. Supernatural. Beyond comprehension at this point. But the creationists and the Darwinists will not acknowledge that. They just say, take our word for it, it happened the way we say it didn't. Take my word for it, it happened some way that they don't know and I don't know, nobody knows. We still need to seek out how this happened. Okay, but so what do we know that did happen? Next slide. This is what happened. The Earth and the Moon coalesced out of the primordial cloud of dust and gas about 4.5 billion years ago. For the first 500 million years, we have just this bombardment of a seething ball of lava by comets and asteroids, and then suddenly the first life forms, prokaryotic bacteria, appear. Prokaryotic bacteria have no cell nucleus. And you would think, since they're the first thing that appears, that they would have waited till the Earth cooled off and you could actually have chemical, because heat breaks things apart. So you would assume it would have occurred down here. But no, it occurred way up here at around 4 billion years ago. And you would also assume that one kind would have come, and really two kinds came, two completely distinct kinds, apples and oranges. And they're indestructible. Indestructible. Things that just can live anywhere, any kind of environment. It is almost as if, indeed, they were put here because they could survive. So it's clear from the very beginning life did not begin here. And everybody on the other side, everybody in the scientific world knows it didn't begin here. It couldn't begin here. Now they're trying to say that, well, maybe it happened in hydrothermal vents, which are really hot and all that. Garbage, garbage. It came here. There wasn't enough time for it to develop, and the conditions were just absurdly hostile to life. All right, so anyway, prokaryotes, they continue down till 2 billion years, and just when the Earth is cooling off, just when you need something to come on board that'll really start pumping some oxygen into the atmosphere, you get it with the eukaryotes. Much bigger, but still single-cell bacteria, but much bigger, much more complex, many more strands of DNA. And they really, and what makes them different is that they have a cell nucleus. And everything else after that has a cell nucleus, including us. There are nuclei in our cells. So we are eukaryotic creatures, basically. So the eukaryotes, prokaryotes continue on, and notice they continue on all the way to the end from where they start. There's really basically no evolution in them. And you would think that if anything was going to evolve, it would be the first things that would come, but apparently not. So anyway, you have the eukaryotes down to 1 billion years, and then you have the first complex life, the ediacaran fauna. We don't know what they were. We don't know if they were plants or animals, but there they are. And then here at around 500, that's a billion years, 600 million years, around 530 million years ago. You see these little two lines right here? See this kind of crabby looking thing? This is something that is so unexpected, so incredible, so otherworldly, that not even Darwinists seriously try to pretend that this was a Darwinian event. This is the Cambrian explosion. Next slide. The Cambrian explosion occurs basically overnight. You saw the little blip of time relative to all that had come, and you have the seas suddenly filled with thousands, literally thousands of plants and animals. All 26 animal phyla that we still have today, no new ones since 530 million years ago approximately. And the whole package arrives at once. You have males and females, you have predators and prey, you have big, you have small, and they're just dumped here. And more importantly, there is no mass extinction to participate this. It's like somebody decides one day, okay, the eukaryotes have pumped enough oxygen in there for these higher life forms to live, let's dump them in. In my book, I call it cosmic dump trucks, but think of it however you want. They just appear. Next slide. Okay, and from there you have, from after the Cambrian explosion, you have the full panoply of complex life as we know it. And that's just the last 500 million years, 1/9 of the whole time, and you have sea worms turning into fish, fish turning into amphibians, amphibians turning into reptiles, reptiles turning into mammals and birds. How did that happen? Macroevolution, we are told. Gills into lungs, fins into limbs, scales into skin. Whole body part changes, species into species, macroevolution. Where does that come from? Charles Darwin. You all know that, right? Next slide. What Darwin saw, though, was microevolution on the Galapagos Islands. Now, these are not Darwin's finches from the Galapagos. These are honeycreepers from Hawaii, because Hawaii is 6 million years old and the Galapagos are 3 million years old, so you get a lot more variation. But still, as you see, you have the nectar and insect eaters, the fruit eaters, the seed eaters. It's the same principle in the Galapagos with Darwin's finches. And he saw this and he said, well, if you can have changes in the micro parts of their bodies, the beaks, and the same thing with the tortoises and other things, if you can have micro change, it stands to reason. He saw no proof, but he says it stands to reason that you can have macroevolution over a very long period of time. And it does stand to reason. I would have agreed with that back then. It's just that they've been looking for 140 years for good, solid examples of evolution from at the macro level, and they don't have it. They can't find it. It doesn't exist. Microevolution is real. Macroevolution is not. So what is real? Next slide. This is what really happens. Notice again the Cambrian explosion, no catastrophe, but otherwise the history of life on Earth is ruled by catastrophes, mass extinctions, things happen. And what happens is, you have 5 majors and you have several minor, but with the majors, between 50 and 90% of everything living gets wiped out. So that if indeed evolution worked, you should see it clearest right after these events when the fossil record is wiped relatively clean. You should see some kind of transition because the ecological niches get filled up fairly soon thereafter, within a few thousand years, within a few million years, whatever it takes for the Earth to stabilize in its new environment. But that's not what you see. You see the Cambrian explosion all over again in the fossil record. Each time there are just new deposits of things. And these things that come in can survive in the new environment, whatever it is. And the survivor species were those that were able to survive in the new environment, whatever it was. Again, cosmic dump trucks every time, and again without a mass extinction right here. It seems very much guided. Very much guided. It's like, oh, okay, Earth's ready to go, needs some more stuff, and there it is. Now, how does science explain this? They say, well, there's something called the punctuated equilibrium model, which means that when Darwinism can work naturally, it does, but when it can't, it knows somehow in the surviving species, they know that it's time for them to speciate rapidly and dramatically. This is the patch that they've put on the obvious gaping hole caused by the fossil record. And what it says is this: when a kernel of popcorn pops itself into what's its next phase? Just a piece of popcorn, right? And that would be its next step up the evolutionary ladder. Somehow after these extinction events, the survivors, whether it's 50% or 90%, know each little kernel of popcorn is now supposed to pop itself into a big bucket full of popcorn. That's punctuated equilibrium. It's ridiculous. Like everything else that they propose, it is just ridiculous if you look at it. Next slide. Oh, excuse me. Now we're going to talk about human. That's okay. It's all right. Now we're going to talk about this guy right here. That's life. Now we're going to talk about humans. Next slide. All right. This is a cartoon. Sums it up about as best as it can be done. About as well as it can be done. Everything is eat, survive, reproduce, and we have the incredible ability to stand there and say, what's it all about? How'd that happen? What we're told is that we and this guy right here share a common ancestor between 8 and 5 million years ago. 8 and 5 million years ago. Because we know we have upright walking creatures around 4 million years ago, so they just back it up enough to give time for those creatures to learn how to walk, because they're obviously on the way to becoming human if they can walk upright. But the truth of it is, this guy, if you take off the tail, the cartoonist didn't know what I bet most of you folks think, which is that monkeys preceded apes. You think monkeys preceded apes, don't you? Isn't that the logical thing? The apes would lose their tails over time. The reality of it is the apes appear first and in great numbers in the Miocene around 25 million years ago. Miocene apes. You got a couple of dozen species of them. All the way from Gigantopithecus, which is up to about right there, down to one's bigger than me, one's my size, one's smaller than me, down to gibbons and orangutans like today. Lots of Miocene apes, no tails, and very few monkey species alive at the time. The apes dominated. So take off the tail. Now, also the Miocene apes are distinctive because a lot of them had arms as long as their legs, approximately. Now, this is a problem. This is why you don't hear anything about the Miocene, because it's a big problem. If only quadrupeds, if only the 4 quadrupeds that we have today, the gorillas, chimps, orangs, and gibbons, were coming out of the Miocene, all of them should have had arms longer than their legs, because to be a quadruped, you have to have arms longer than your legs to walk and move around comfortably. But in the Miocene, there were several of them that had arms as equal to their legs. And what does that imply? That they weren't quadrupeds. So what else would they be? Bipeds. But they don't want bipeds walking out of the Miocene because they want walking to be something that only something on the way to being human can learn to do. Walking is critical. Walking is key. So they obscure the fact that walkers could have been walking their way out of the Miocene at 20 million years right through when they say we know for sure we had a walker. Next slide. And we know for sure we had a walker at 3.5 million years ago because of the Laetoli tracks in Tanzania. Everybody know what those are? No. Okay. Laetoli tracks were found in Tanzania in 1978 and an ash fall that had occurred 3.5 million years ago. Two upright walking creatures, clearly walking upright, a larger and a smaller, we think it was a male and female, left their tracks. Then they were covered over again with another ash fall and discovered by a miracle in 1978. Just one of the great, great discoveries in archaeology and anthropology in the world. And so what we have here is a clear shot of the foot of this creature, these creatures, and it's walking upright for sure, but it's not exactly a human foot. It's not exactly a human foot, which is understandable because, why? 3.5 million years, plenty of time for evolution and change, right? Next slide. And here's what we get. We evolve from this to this. Now with the human foot you have a nice hard heel strike. You have the ankle back here a little off center. You have the forward momentum swinging around the arch here, and it gathers here, but it just swings right over, and then it really gathers here and thrusts out the big toe, and the other toes act as balancers and thrusters. So we have a kind of an unusual twisty kind of motion here, out and around and over and through. But on this foot, at 3.5 million years ago, we have a completely different way of walking. We have a very light heel strike, equal to the forefoot strike. We have the ankle centered up dead center. We have a toe off with sort of the front ball area of the foot, and the toes are acting completely differently. What we have here is a foot coming down very lightly and very smoothly, very evenly, clunk, smooth, lift up, very smooth lift up, very smooth come down, and a very straight line. So, at 3.5 million years ago, guess what? It's walking way better than we walk. It's walking way better than we walk. We went downhill big time in that evolution that supposedly occurred. Next slide. All right, this is the person that made it, Lucy. You've all heard of Lucy, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, found in Ethiopia in 1974. We know for sure she was upright walking at 3.2 million years, so the assumption is that her type made the tracks at Laetoli at 3.5 million years ago. Okay? The thing to remember about her is her bones are very much more robust than ours. She stood about 3'6" to 3'8". If this was a human being of that size, the upper arm bone would be about that much shorter, and it would be the size of these bones right here. Very robust. Next slide. What she was part of this group, the Australopithecines. 2 upright walking chimps, 2 upright walking gorillas. From about 4 million years ago, roughly, to around 2 million years ago, roughly. A little overlap, but basically the Australopithecines, 2 upright walking chimps, 2 upright walking gorillas. She was Afarensis, Africanus, Robustus, Boise. Can we get a little better focus? Is it out of focus for anybody but me? You guys seeing it okay? All right. And you see the crests here, so you know they were upright walking gorillas. This is the first group, 4 million, 2 million. Next slide. Segues into the next group at around 2 million years ago, right on through to us, and these are the early homos, and sure enough, they are more man-like. Homo means man. Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo archaic, Neanderthal, and a Neanderthal skullcap, and then Cro-Magnon, us, at around 120,000 years ago in the fossil record. All of these bones are very, very dense, very, very thick, just like Lucy's bones. You have no forehead. You have huge brow ridges. You have big, round night vision eyes. You have big noses, big, wide nasal passages, wide noses spread across the face. You have upper mouths that stick off the face. You have a lower jaw that does the same thing, and you have no chin. These folks are upright walking primates, just as these were as well, the Australopithecines. You have primates right on through until you get right here, and then you have something completely different. It has much lighter bone, it has a forehead, it has very much reduced eye sockets, poor night vision, a nose squeezed in and sticking up off the face, the mouth pushed in, lower jaw pushed in, chin pushed out. In every major feature, it's exactly the opposite. This is a transition. This is a transformation. Something happened here. Okay, next slide. This is one of those guys, this is a Homo erectus called the Lake Turkana boy. This is one of the early homos, the best preserved skeleton that we have from the ancient past. And we know he's a boy because his molars hadn't come in yet, so we figure he's about 12 years old. At 12, he stood about 5'8". In adulthood, he's going to go 6'2", 6'6". We don't know how they grew, but we do know this. He's going to be a brute because every bone at 12 in his body is bigger than any bone in Arnold Schwarzenegger's body. Now, what's the point of that? The point is the incredible strength that primates have relative to us. Most people are not aware of this, but all primates are 5 to 10 times as strong as we are, pound for pound. 5 to 10 times. If anybody's had a pet monkey, they know what I'm talking about. Those skinny little arms can break your finger if you make them. Okay? So another thing, speaking of arms, is look at the incredible length from here to here and even here. It makes their hands drape down around their knees. That's true with all the pre-humans. Their arms are about the same, in fact, about the same size, roughly, as their legs, going all the way back to the Miocene. Distinctively different. Next slide. Okay, here again we see Neanderthals, supposedly our kissing cousins until just recently when we found out genetically that they're really not. But up until then, any anthropologist would have told you, oh yeah, we just evolved from these guys. Look at the difference. Look at the fingertip here compared to ours. Section of thigh bone compared to ours. What does this mean? That this thing has the strength of 17 motors. I mean, it's strong, very, very powerful relative to us. Why? Because your bones are a signal for how strong your muscles were, because there's no point in having bones that will snap under the torque that your muscles can generate. Next slide. So what we have here is some diagrams to show in the pre-humans. Now again, the bones are bigger and more robust than ours. That's not really clear here. The hand position is very clear relative to ours. The distinctive upside down triangle rib cage of primates is very clear relative to ours. What you can't tell is that their necks are tucked down into their shoulders in the standard primate thing, and that's what gives you that top look there to the rib cage, because they've got it all punched in like this relative to us. And why? Because they don't have our voice boxes. They don't have the ability to speak. Primates don't. They've been trying to teach Coco to speak for, what, 20 years? She can communicate very well, but she can never speak. She doesn't have the tool in there, which requires a lengthening of the neck. All right? And of course they all have the same thing that all the primates have, the lack of forehead, the big round night vision eyes, the big wide noses spread across the face, the mouths that stick off, the lack of a chin, all the same. So what this is telling us is that there's not a single human bone in the so-called pre-human fossil record. There's just not. And guess what? Anthropologists won't argue the point. They can't. A third grader can see this. So what they say is, yes, you're right. There's not a human bone in the pre-human fossil record. That's why we call it the pre-human fossil record. But don't get excited. We're going to find the guy that's going to stand here and show a smooth and perfect transition into that guy, and that will be the missing link. Garbage. There is no missing link, never was a missing link, never going to be a missing link. They've been looking 140 years, they don't have a finger bone of the missing link. And even if they found it, they would need another half dozen or dozen to stand in there and show a transition, a Darwinian transition, from these guys to this guy. It isn't going to happen. It is the worst kind of pipe dream that they put out there to keep y'all stupid, to keep y'all believing what they want you to believe. It's just not true. Okay, next slide. So what we're looking at here is just what I said, a lie. Just a lie. This is a transition. The brains are getting bigger. I'll acknowledge that. Transformation right here. Transformation, magic occurred here. But something else this represents, there's another lie this represents, which is that all these went extinct 30,000 years ago. The last of them, the Neanderthals. You all know that, right? They went extinct, and those that wouldn't go, we drove them extinct. We killed them all. Could we do it? Yes, of course we could. We're pack animals and we're smart. We're wolves with spears. We can do it. One of them could walk in here right now, pop my head off my body like it was a cherry off a soda, rip my arms off my torso, rip my legs off in about 30 seconds. But they're not going to catch me by myself in those times. We're going to catch them by themselves, and we're going to kill them. So what are they going to do? Are we going to kill them all? No. They're going to go where we can't go. We can't go. And we can't go into really deep, tough montane forests and jungles. We think we do. We think we do. We think we are masters of all we survey. We don't survey half of what we claim to be masters of. Half the world, just recently they determined this is still uncharted wilderness. I don't know about over here, but in the United States for sure, United States, mind you, 25% of the land of the United States has never once been foot surveyed. Never once. Why? It's just too hard to, or somebody sitting there saying, what? Yeah, it's just too hard to get in there. I know it's astonishing, but it's true. It's just too physically hard for human beings to get in there and do that work. That is half of the arable land of the earth. Keep it in mind, those kind of areas. So it would be very easy for them, if they wanted to just go there. Just get away from us where we can't go. We wanted their prime territory. The savannas, the prairies, the lightly wooded areas. It's the only place we can live physically when we hit the ground there on earth. We drove them out. Furthermore, the whole thing about the 30,000 years ago is based on that they don't make fossils anymore. Well, guess what? Those areas don't produce fossils. There is not to this day a single chimpanzee bone, fossil bone, that we know of. And the few that we think of other primates, might be other primates that live in those areas, are questionable. What's it all about? It's very hard to make a fossil, and they're made only in very distinctive conditions. You get caught in a flash flood, you get wrapped up in the mud, or you get killed at the water hole, and before the predator that killed you can eat you, a herd of wildebeest or something comes, stomp you down into the mud, and then you can be turned into a fossil. Otherwise, you get eaten, and Mother Nature cleans the plate. Bacteria and fungus chew up the bones down to nothing. If she didn't, we'd walk out of this building and there'd be 1,000-foot high piles of bones everywhere. Mother Nature cleans her plate, and she really does it well in a forest, in a jungle, because there's no water hole to die at. You get your liquid out of the environment. Do you understand? It's very easy for these creatures to still be alive in half the world out there, sharing it with us. And if that's true, what does it mean? It means that there's a logical answer for those thousands and thousands of reports from around the world, from every continent except Antarctica. There's an answer for those reports of what? Upright walking, large, various sized, hair-covered, primate-looking creatures known as hominoids. That's every continent except Antarctica. You get thousands of reports over hundreds of years of upright walking, hair-covered, primate-looking creatures. Those guys, I contend. Next slide. Here's what they look like in life. This is a Bigfoot statue carved in Willow Creek, California. This man's about 5'8", so you get an idea. But this is one of 4 kinds. This is the Bigfoot Sasquatch kind. They are 7 to 10 feet tall, weigh 700 to 1,000 pounds. But you also have the abominable snowman Yeti kind. And that's about, quote, man size, 5 to 7 feet tall, 300 to 600 pounds. Those are found exclusively in the Himalayas. There's another man-sized kind, again, 5 to 7 feet tall, 300 to 600 pounds, called almas, and they dominate in the mountains of southern Russia and western China, but they're found, again, on every continent except Antarctica. The last kind are the agagwes. They're about 4 feet tall, they weigh about 200 pounds, and they're found in the jungles of the world, in that band of jungle that circles the equator around the world. The agagwes. 4 different kinds, and no matter who sees them, they all say the same thing. Well, you know, it had no forehead, it had big round brow ridges, big heavy brow ridges, it had big round eye sockets with eyes deep set, big nose across its face, mouth sticking off, no chin, head kind of tucked into its shoulders, arms hanging down to its knees, and it's covered with hair from head to toe. Take away the hair, and what did I just describe to a T? The pre-humans. The pre-humans. They're not pre-humans. They're pre-hominoids. They fit like a glove. And that is why most of you who walked in here today think this is stupid and silly and belongs in the tabloids. It's because you're brainwashed to believe that. Why? Because science does not want you to make that link between the pre-humans and the living hominoids. Because as soon as you do, it means one thing and one thing only. Humans have no place in the flowchart of life on Earth. And they do not want everybody to wake up to that idea. Because it is nothing but problems for them, for religion, for government, for everybody. It is a hornet's nest. And so they keep it in the tabloids and they keep you dumbed down. They keep everybody dumbed down about this subject. Okay, so it's easy for me to stand up here and say, oh, well, yeah, okay, big feet are real. Maybe I've lost some of you in talking about it. But let me say this, there's proof for it to back it up. Tracks. They're big, they're heavy, and they leave tracks all over the place. In the last 50 years, we have collected over 10,000 tracks that have been either plaster casted or photographed or both of creatures like this from around the world. All four kinds around the world, every continent except Antarctica. Plenty of tracks. Now, what we're told, of course, by science is they're all fakes. Every last one of them is a fake. Why? Because human beings can fake tracks, and so if human beings exist and they can fake them, ipso facto, they're all a fake. What do we know about tracks? Tracks we know plenty about. There's a science called ichnology, which is the study of tracks in fossils. We know that from primitive times on, what's the one thing you have to teach your children about where you live? How to read the tracks in the area so they don't fall prey to a predator. We know about tracks. What do we know? Two basic rules. Next slide. When you take a living fleshy foot and press it down into a suitable medium, it is so broken into pieces. It's so, can't think of the word. But anyway, 26 bones, 33 joints, sequential, that's it, so sequential. It comes out so sequential that you get a little push from the midline out, and you get in little lines in here called compression lines. They're small, but they're there. Okay, next slide. If you hit with an artificial foot, whether it be plastic, rubber, wood, it doesn't matter. It's not going to be in pieces. We don't have those even for amputees. So they're going to go down as a piece. They're going to be stamped. They're going to be pressed. And they're going to make a distinctive look. It's going to all go out at once, so they make these little ridges with cracks on the top, and on the outside it's called impact ridges. I can give that little lesson to third graders and lay some tracks out here, fake and real. Give them a magnifying glass, they won't miss one. Neither would you. And yet all those 10,000 tracks that look pretty doggone good to a lot of experts are all ipso facto fakes. Not because they really are, but because they can't be real and maintain the paradigm that we live with today. Next slide. All right, again, I want you to remember how a human foot works. Heavy heel strike, swing around the arch, collect itself, the energy in the ball of the foot, thrust out off the big toe, and the other four acting as balancers and then part of the thrusting mechanism. Next slide. This is a typical hominoid track. It's a Bigfoot track, 16 inches long, but you get the idea. Ankle in the middle, heel extended, forefoot shortened and widened, toes acting all together. There's no thrust mark through here. The thrusting is coming off through the whole foot. You see the force line going through here. Instead of that zigzag thing we have, again, what do you have here? Smooth down, smooth up. Look, you see there's no heavy dent, no worse than here. Smooth down, smooth up. What does that indicate? A bent-kneed walk, a smooth, gliding walk, a better walk than ours. And just like the footprint at Laetoli 3.5 million years ago. 3.5 million years ago. Basically no change. Next slide. Again, compare a human foot with a Bigfoot track. See the differences. Ankle up here. Complete redesign of the foot. Next slide. And here are a couple of more hominoid tracks you see right here. Now these come from a clay floor in a cave, so that's why they look like they do. But look, again, we found them together. We think, just like the Laetoli tracks, we think it was a male and a female living together. And you see that they have all of the classic hominoid hallmarks, all of them, right? Except guess what? These are not hominoid tracks. These are Neanderthal tracks. Absolutely Neanderthal tracks. 30,000 years ago, Toriano, Italy, Neanderthal. Looking for all the world like hominoid tracks. So what does that mean? The Neanderthals are hominoids. The Neanderthals are hominoids. What does that mean? That the pre-humans are not pre-human, they're pre-hominoid. They are hominoids. There's no change, there's no pre-anything. They're coming from 20 million years walking right down to the present time out there in the woods, sharing the planet with us. No change. Furthermore, this will really shock you now. Remember, the Laetoli tract was made 3.5 million years by an Australopithecine, we are told. And yet here is a Neanderthal foot looking astonishingly like it. Check the toe area and remember that. Now, next slide. Look, you remember? No change in 3.5 million years. No change. No fundamental change in 3.5 million years. Walking the same, looking the same. Coming right out of the Miocene, walking out of the Miocene. Walking is not something you learn. Walking is something that was gifted to these creatures by someone, somehow, somewhere. And it's better than the way we walk. They don't torque their knees the way we do. They don't lock their knees. They don't twist themselves through. Their joints don't wear out when they get old the way ours do. We walk inefficiently compared to them. Next slide. Okay, here's a comparison, believe it or not, of the only foot of a prehuman that we have, Neanderthal. They buried a couple very late in their lifestyle, and in their time on Earth, and that we know about. And we have a foot of a Neanderthal, a human, Neanderthal. Look at the difference. Look at the little nub of a heel we have relative to this big heavy heel. Look at the big ankle bone pressed forward compared to our little ankle bone. Look at the thin foot relative to this here. Notice too that the foot itself is going to wrap around here full of muscle and pad. This is a foot designed to walk barefoot for a lifetime. We don't have that. And look at how off balance we are. Look at the difference in our big toe relative to those, and look at the spread here. Look how smooth and steady and solid that is. We're off balance. You can see it right there. This is so much a better way to walk. This is so much a better foot. We need a redesign. What happened? What happened? We're a mess compared to them. Next slide. Okay, now the panda is a classic example of what you're all sitting there thinking right now. Well, wait a minute. If you're right and these things are out there, why don't we just mount up and go get one? I mean, we're humans. We can do anything we put our minds to. Why don't we just go get one and prove you're right or wrong? Well, it's not as easy as that, and the panda proves it. The panda was the hominoid of the 1800s. Stories would come out of China of this black and white bear that ate bamboo, and every expert, what, bamboo? Give us a break. Every bear in the world's a carnivore. Come on. Nobody'd go look. So a French naturalist was there in 1869, and he got one, and they knew it was real. It died shortly thereafter, but they knew it was real. Every zoo and museum in the world that had the money poured teams into Sichuan province, China, which is about as big as France, I understand. Covered in bamboo forests, but very rugged mountainous terrain where the montane forests are that the hominoids live in. Okay? And they started, and they really, really poured money and effort into it. How long do you think it took, starting in 1870, to get the next panda in hand? 60 years, folks. 60 years. Now, it sounds like an exaggeration, and it is. They only looked for 30 years, and they said, well, they have to be extinct now. And then 30 years later, our President Teddy Roosevelt's sons were out there doing some hunting, and they killed one by accident. Shot something out of a tree. They didn't know what it was, and it turned out to be a panda. Now, in those 60 years, what was the panda doing to escape our notice? Nothing. Nothing. As you can see, it's brightly colored, it's big, you've all seen what pandas look like. It stands out like a sore thumb against its green background that it lives in. It lives by day, very slow moving, eats a very restricted diet, stupid as can be. What are they doing? Nothing. The problem is with us. We're not handling the terrain. So imagine, if you will, and by the way, over the next 20 years after they got the one in 1930, they only got a half a dozen more. Pouring effort into it. So we're going to mount up and go get something that's big, fast, go anywhere, eat anything, live mostly at night, and in its environment, see better than us, hear better than us, smell better than us, and no doubt think better than us. It isn't going to happen. But what will happen is there will be accidental encounters as they encroach into the edges of our environments where we live, and as we encroach into the edges of their environments where they live. We do go in there. We hunt. We'll build roads through them. But we don't live in the heart of darkness. We can't physically do it. That's where they live. But we see about 150 accidental sightings every year around the world that are considered really good. They are out there. Now, in my book, I don't have time to do it today, but in my book, we're going to go over very quickly, some of the better sighting reports. Next slide. We have the Patterson film. You've all seen this. You've all heard the stories. It's a man in an ape suit. Forget about it. 1967. You can see the muscles rippling in the shoulders and the legs. Absolutely impossible even today to get that effect. We have the arm clearly breaking at an elbow much longer than a human elbow can break as it strides along. We have its bent-kneed stride. The walk is really the key to it. We have the perfectly mammalian-looking breasts, very fleshy, very bulbous-looking as they swing around. They've got the natural look. In every way, this is the real deal. I have the full details in the book. Next slide. This is the famous Minnesota Iceman. A guy shot it in the back in Minnesota, of course. You see the nice big hole it blew out in its chest. He took it and he put it in a 7-foot floor freezer, and instead of turning it over to science, we could have had this whole thing solved in 1967 when he shot it, but he was a real creep and he wanted to make a fortune. So he put it in a floor freezer, put it in the back of a Mack truck, and took it around to shopping malls and fairs in the States for about 12 years. When something's frozen, it doesn't last forever, till it rotted to the point where he couldn't show it. But nonetheless, I saw it when I was a young man. I go over the details in the book in great detail, but trust me, this was the real deal. Real, true hominoid, shot dead, laying there. Next slide. This is Albert Ostman. Great story. As a young man in the early 1920s, he was taken and snatched up on a camping trip by a male Bigfoot and hauled off to the camp where he lived with his family. His partner and there are two offspring, two juvenile offspring, a male and a female, and he spent 6 days with them and didn't tell a soul for 33 years until he was about 65. And he read a report in a paper of someone else seeing one and asking for anybody seen one of these, and he says, well, here's what happened to me a long time ago. And when everybody found out what happened to him, they descended on him, grilled him to death, made him go through all kind of lie detector tests. He never flubbed anything, and he knew things about them nobody else did at that point, but which subsequently, after people knew to look, they found out were true. Albert Ostman, great story, in the book in full detail. Next slide. Perhaps the best one of all, Alma, the Alma from Russia named Zana, Z-A-N-A. Remember now, Almas are not Bigfoot. Those others were. Almas are man-size. 5 to 7 feet tall, 300, 600 pounds. They are living Neanderthals. In my opinion, they're living Neanderthals. And this was found in the mountains of southern Russia where they hang out in a band all the way over to western China. She was captured and held in a village from 1850, the village was Takina in modern-day Turkmenistan, until 1890 when she died. When they did the research on this in the mid-60s, there were still 100 people living in 1960s that had known her when they were young. So they have tremendous corroborative testimony about what she was like and what her life was like. Great stuff, again, in the book, detail. Okay, what all this means, though, is, if you'll just take my word for it, the hominoids are, again, living right out of the Miocene as they always have, no change, and that humans have no place in the flowchart of life on Earth, period. So if we don't, how do we get here? Well, our fossils start showing it around 120,000 years ago, so that's a clue. We are late comers, and we appear like everything else. The truth, I think, is going to be found, and I could be wrong, but I think very strongly the truth is going to be found in modern-day Sumer, which is Iraq. Incredibly enough, Iraq, where the war is going on right now. But way back 4,000 BC, 6,000 years ago, it was Sumer. And the Sumerians walk out of the Stone Age at around 6,000 years ago and create one of the very highest cultures of ancient times. Stone Age, high culture, over 100 of the first that we attribute to a high culture. How did that happen? Well, it's inexplicable, so they don't talk about the Sumerians very much. Next slide. What the Sumerians did was they created the first great cities, the first high-rise buildings, the ziggurats, the first well-ordered cities. They had the first government, the first legislature. They had the first education. They had the first running water in their buildings, not like faucets, but 2 tracks, one for fresh, one for waste. They were geniuses with water. Wherever they went, geniuses with water. They had the first wheeled vehicles, the first wide trade networks, the first ocean-going vessels, everything but cable TV. I mean, these folks had it. And they passed it down to the Egyptian, Greeks, and Romans, which we believe are how culture really began and sort of crawled its way up. It didn't happen like that at all. So the Sumerians are sort of left off the chart, and all that we get about them when we're taught is what? Writing. They invented writing. It's as if they appeared, boop, created writing, and then boop, disappeared. Not true at all. They had a good, strong run of about 2,000 years. Again, part of the brainwashing necessary to keep you dumbed down about these facts. Next slide. This is the writing, cuneiform, a very sophisticated type of writing based on a mathematical model. Very sophisticated. Still hard to read, but about 200 people can do it. And most of the 100,000 or so tablets that they left in their libraries, because again they had education, libraries were first, were these, when they say clay tablets, they were clay originally, but then they would bake them in kilns, another first, very sophisticated device to turn them into stone. So the biblical term, written in stone, you know, comes from here. And they say what they say. Most of them are just trade things like, you know, horses, mules, grain, whatever. And then you have these stories where they tell what they say was their history, what science says is their myths. Why? Because their myths don't match up with what we think their history ought to be. But I ask you this, who gives the first culture a myth? Who hands it down to them? If it starts with them, it's a history. Myth is everywhere else, Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans. Okay, next slide. Another way they communicated was through cylinder seals. Now, if they wanted to put something away in the library, they put it on those tablets. If they wanted to communicate with the people, they put it on cylinder seals. And what they would do is they'd carve it into these hard stones, because they're going to use them a lot, run them across slabs of clay, and you get these beautiful scenes, kind of like that cartoon, you know, Eat, Survive, Reproduce, what's it all about? We all knew that. That's millions of words, that's thousands of volumes boiled down into one cartoon, and we all understood what it meant. Same thing with these. All the Sumerians would know what this was symbolizing, what event, whatever it was. The key to this is these things are about, believe it or not, about the size of a spool of thread. They're about 1 inch to 2 inches high. And notice, this is real important. I want you to notice because you see this in scientific writing all the time. Seal makers apparently drill details into the stone, then refine them with abrasives. There are no abrasives that will go and make these little lines here. This is less than a square inch. It's garbage. It's BS to just keep you. You sit there and say, oh, okay. And you just accept it and you move on. They don't know how they did it. You ought to see some of those things in the British Museum. They're that big. They're as big as the end of your little finger. Incredible and impossible. Next slide. Okay, this is one in Germany. It's called The Granting of the Plow. Seated God with a plow in his hand. Standing God, we know they're gods because of the helmets. And he's handing him a plow. And here's a human in tow with a simple, ugly digging stick. And it's really pretty cool to say that the Sumerians believed that the gods gave them the ability to farm the land. But what's really cool about this one is this right here, of course. Next slide. Remember now, we're talking something 2000 BC, 4,000 years ago. It's solar system. Mercury, Venus, Earth, Moon, Mars. Get back to that in a minute. Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto as a moon of Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. The Sumerians believed that the solar system started with Pluto as a moon of Saturn. Our astronomers today acknowledge that Pluto had to come from one of the outer moons or from somewhere else because it's 17 degrees off the ecliptic. Anything that would have been formed naturally would be on the ecliptic. So, everybody with me? Later, though, they changed and they knew what the real solar system looked like. Next slide. They said that Earth was not the third rock from the sun, but it was number 7. They counted from the outside and they knew that Pluto and the rest were all where they belonged. And furthermore, they wrote that Uranus and Neptune, seen out in the heavens, were blue-green watery twins. Now, before Voyager went out there and proved that this was true, you ask any astronomer what these two are like, and they say, oh, cold, dead rocks being that far out away from the sun. No way. And yet they're slushy, kind of blue-green planets, to the surprise of absolutely everyone except the Sumerians who knew it 4,000 years ago. What were they doing writing about this? When we only found this out in the last 300 years that they were even there. How'd they know this? They said that people on that planet, you remember that planet up there that didn't belong where the asteroid belt should be? That planet is Nibiru. Nibiru. And instead of being like these planets going in counterclockwise circles, Nibiru goes in a clockwise ellipse 3,600 years. 3,600 years. And on that planet Nibiru is a race of beings called the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki. And the Anunnaki came to Earth around 400,000 years ago, lived here for a very long time, and did a couple of things that are very interesting while they were here. They left their fingerprints all over the planet, and they created humanity to be their slaves and their servants. We shall create the Adamu, they wrote in those stone tablets, in our own image after our own likeness. Adamu, plural, and of course comes down as Adam in the Bible. And by the way, where they lived in Sumer, what they called it was the Eden. So Eden, among other things. Okay, next slide. One of the proofs that the Anunnaki were here, that I said the fingerprints were all over the place, is Stonehenge. This was 50 tons. And these megaliths are everywhere. Tiwanaku, Teotihuacan, Baalbek, the pyramids. They're all over the place. And we are told by scientists that somehow primitive people built these things, cut the stones, drug them where they are, and put them up. Somehow, some way, they knew how to do it. And the focus is always on how did they move them? How'd they move them? How'd they get them? The documentaries that you see, how'd they move them? How'd they put them in place? Absurd. That's not the problem. Next slide. This is the problem. An ancient 1,170-ton obelisk lies unfinished at the Aswan Quarry, a crack rendered the stone unusable. Anybody been there? Anybody seen it? It's in a hole, isn't it? In a hole, a complete hole, 15 feet deep. You can see the edge here, and the guy took the picture standing here, and this crack isn't that big around the sides. And here it's clearly being worked. It's pink granite. We're told that all this work is done as stone on stone. The blue stones at Stonehenge are the hardest stones in the world. What do you work them with? This pink granite is one of the hardest stones in the world. Now, do you see stone on stone at work here? They're making the spire with some probably huge contraption strapped onto it and pressing so hard that it's pulling whole chunks of pink granite out the size of the seat that you're sitting on. When they press too hard here somewhere, and as you know the forces of physics, it caused a crack to break here, and they said, oh, we busted it. Unhook the machine, let's go to the next one. And they made all kinds of things like this around Egypt. Oh, go back. Oops. Okay, so the real question here is not how they did it or how they moved it, it's how did they make that last cut on the bottom? For us to do that today would be impossible. First of all, we'd have to peel all this back so we could get a huge big machine with a big whirling diamond tip blade to start underneath it, and as soon as it went a few feet, the pressure would stop the blade. It can't be done. Does everybody understand? And they're bigger stones than this one. 2,000 tonners in Baalbek and other places. Totally impossible. It's another one of those garbage things they tell you to keep you dumbed down about the possibility that there was indeed alien life on Earth. So if they were here for sure, is there anything to what the Sumerians said about them creating us as slaves and servants? Yes, there is. Next slide. How are we doing for time? How are we doing here? Okay, great. Mitochondrial DNA. We found out in the late 70s that if we checked the mitochondrial DNA of our females, we could find out how far the line went back. So they said, okay, great. Let's find out if we broke from the common ancestor at 8 million years ago or 5 million years ago. So they took samples of DNA, mitochondrial DNA, which only passes down from females, from women all over the world, and what they found out was, lo and behold, it's not 8, it's not 5 million years ago. It's all the way down to 200,000 years ago. To everyone's great surprise, we don't exist as a species according to our mitochondrial DNA prior to approximately 200,000 years ago. What a surprise. So what the anthropologists have to say is, well, there was some little group somewhere, some little cluster somewhere, and all the others like us died out, and that little cluster somehow around 200,000 years ago, that little bottleneck somehow created the whole species. Garbage. Garbage. More garbage. Next slide. What they found is not that we existed, not only existed 200,000 years ago, that where we came from was South Africa. Not only when we came, but where we came. The oldest of us, the oldest of our females, come from southern Africa. Guess what the Sumerians said? We were created in southern Africa. So they're writing this 4,000 years ago. They're calling it on the nose. They're saying it around 200,000 years ago in southern Africa. And that's what our geneticists are turning up. Now, just for laughs, you can imagine how this Newsweek cover went over in the Deep South, in Louisiana and places like that where I come from. They tried to make these blacks look as white as they could, hoping they could skate down in the South. But, of course, it ticked off blacks everywhere, and they caught it coming and going. But they did tell the truth. Okay, next slide. This is another indication of some tampering with the cerebral cortex is the deeply convoluted surface region of the brain that is most strongly linked to intelligence. That's this stained part on the outside. Strip it off a rat, postage stamp. Monkey, postcard. Chimpanzee, typing, one sheet of typing paper. Human, 4 sheets of typing paper. What the heck happened there? Our closest kin, supposedly. And not only that, we only use maybe half a sheet, maybe 1 sheet. We don't know, but we know we use a very small portion of the brain we've been given. How do we know that? Because of the work with savants. It used to be called idiot savants. And in the damage to their good sheet, they get a little like a spot of light here, spot of light here, spot of light here, somewhere in the remainder, and that'll be art, math, painting, music. You've all seen them. You've all seen their genius so far surpasses our regular geniuses, it's absurd. So we know that since there's over 100 of them, all of our brains have this full capacity, but we, the normal ones, are only using a small part for some reason. Why? The Anunnaki. What do you want your slave to be? Smart as you? No. Smart, but not too smart. Able to take instructions. Here, go here, do this, and come back and tell me when you're done. You give them just enough. But they had to give us their bodies and their brains. Why? Because they didn't want their slaves looking like this guy. Or the hominoids. They wanted it to look like themselves. Why? So they could have some women. There weren't enough women. There were mostly men. So they had a deadline and they went to work to create that slave and servant. Next slide. And they did it how? Genetic manipulation. Genes just the way we do it. You can cut, you can take something out, you can put anything in, and at this level you can put fish into fowl, plant into animal, anything. It all is the same at that level. Why? Because it's all made out of the same 4 base pairs and the same 20 amino acids. It's interchangeable. It's almost as if it's planned. It's almost as if somebody wants the ability to just mix and match and make things to suit the environment when the environment calls for it. It's incredible. Down at this level, it's all the same, like Legos. Next slide. When it was done on us, though, they didn't have time to do it right. They had a deadline. They were dealing with an insurrection. They had a deadline. So they had to crank them out as fast as they could. They're making a slave. Do they care if they're making mistakes? No. Do they care if it affects 1 in 100? No. Do they care if it affects 1 in 10? No. It's a slave. They do not care. So they left a lot of mistakes in us, a lot of genetic defects. And here you've got our full complement of 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs, and you have 28 of our major genetic defects, but we have over 4,000. How does a species collect over 4,000 genetic defects in only 200,000 years when creatures that have been on the earth for sure for millions of years don't have even a couple of handfuls, if that many? And furthermore, how do we as a species get genetic defects that will kill you before you can reach the age of maturity and pass it on into the gene pool? How'd that get into the gene pool? We got a couple of dozen of those. The only way is if it was done with poor genetic cutting and splicing and the mistakes were just left there. It's the only way. This is something that, of course, is never talked about, but which every geneticist in the world is fully aware. Okay? Next slide. Now, this is a comparison of orangutan, gorilla, chimpanzee, human, and as you see, as we're always told, gee, our DNA is an awful lot like them. Well, of course, it's going to be like primate. If we had a hominoid up here, it would probably be even closer. But the key to this slide is not that, not the closeness. Because if you know what you're doing, you can take just a few genes and make some really amazing changes. The problem is what the Anunnaki faced when they wanted to make that slave and the servant. You have to assume they have 46 chromosomes, because we have 46 chromosomes. The only primate with 46 chromosomes. All of the primates have 48. How did that happen? How could we be so much better and have lost 2 chromosomes? It's an awful lot of DNA. How could that happen? Doesn't make sense, does it? And yet we're told we're primates even though we don't have primate bones, we don't have primate muscles, we don't have primate skin, we don't have primate hair patterns. We're thick on front, light on back. We don't have that. We don't have primate heads, we don't have primate brains, we don't have primate faces, we don't have primate anything. We're not primates. So the Anunnaki have to do an important thing. They have to somehow find a way to make a zygote, a living thing, to begin this process. You've got to take a 48 chromosome creature or a 46 chromosome creature, and you've got to make them match up. How do you do that? You're going to have 24 in the sperm, 23 in the egg, 23 in the egg, 24 in the sperm. Can you take away a whole chromosome from the 48? No. Can you take away, can you add a chromosome to yours? Oh, if I didn't say it, they're using the creature of Earth. They say in the tablets, we will use the creature of Earth as a model. They wanted us to be genetically a little bit better adapted to this planet than they were. So they had that 48-46 problem. How could you do it? Sounds impossible, doesn't it? The only way is to take 2 of those chromosomes on the 48 and fuse them together so that all the chromosomal material remains, but it now only takes up 1 space in the connecting process with the 23. You with me on that? Let me see some heads. Okay, next slide. Here we go, the 2nd and 3rd chromosome of the orangutan, gorilla, chimp, but look at ours. Fused. Fused. And scientists say, well, somehow that happened in nature. Nature did that. BS. Nature couldn't do that. That is genetic engineering. There is no clearer proof, I think, blindingly clear proof, that the Anunnaki were correct when they said they created us, the Sumerians were correct in reporting it, and I believe that I'm correct in reporting it to you. Thank you. Hominoids are a problem for present-day scientists because it's very, very clear from the fossil record and the bones that are left in the fossil record of the so-called pre-humans that they match up exactly with the bones of the hominoids. So the first time, the first day, the first moment that a hominoid is found and secured, whether it's dead or alive, and we get a look at its bones and we can compare its bone structure, and particularly the bone structure of its head, with the so-called pre-humans, science is going to know in that moment that it can no longer continue with the charade that human beings somehow evolved from these so-called pre-humans from which they bear no physical resemblance. There would be hundreds of thousands of these hominoids around the world to maintain breeding populations on every continent except Antarctica. Understand that in the United States, we have reports of them, and good reports, from every single state. Wherever there are forests, particularly heavy forests and jungles, these creatures can live. The hominoids do not seem to be evolving at all because they don't seem to have evolved for the last 4 million years. I mean, we showed in my presentation, I showed slides that show that the footprints are virtually the same at 3.5 million years ago, and then for Neanderthal at 30,000 years ago, and there's not a shred of development there. So no, I don't think they're evolving. I think they're living as they lived when they first appeared here, and understand that my belief is that everything appears, nothing evolves, it appears. I think that it's very clear that human genes have been genetically altered and that we are a created species. I talk about in the presentation, and in fact we show very clearly, that we have over 4,000 genetic disorders that we should not have, nearly that many. We're a species only a couple of 100,000 years old. We have 4,000 and counting. That's species-wide. That's from the Watusis to the Eskimos. That could not possibly work itself into the entire gene pool, the entire human gene pool, unless the originating few that started our species had all of them to begin with. The only way they could get all of those genetic deformities to begin with is if they were put there genetically. They did not accumulate over time. If we indeed descended from primates, as we are told we did, then the primates should have those same disorders, or many of them, and they don't. Without the deficiencies, of course, we would live tremendous lifespans. We could live thousands of years rather than the 120 that we have limited if we were, perfectly tuned genetically. What we could do intellectually if we had the totality of our brains, it's unimaginable. We wouldn't be what we are today. We would be a higher being, a higher species. One of the ways I put it is we would be able to take a place at the Galactic Round Table. I think that we're going to find the right, true, and correct answer by pursuing it from scientific means with scientific techniques, but we've got to get the scientists looking. You can't find what you won't look for, and right now they refuse to look for answers in the middle ground because they have to maintain their position against and opposed to the creationists. What we found with it was this piece of maxilla from the middle to the right, okay? So we just doubled it over, and then we made a jaw. We had a dental lab do it. They made it as along human lines. I don't think that this is going to be a human. I think it's going to be less chin, less thickness in it for a number of reasons, but we took it because it was as close as as close as they felt comfortable doing. We had these two teeth here, but it also has teeth up in the upper part of it. This is how we think it might have possibly looked in real life. And this is also the angle of its head, if you notice, so you see how sharply tilted the back of it is relative to a normal human being. You really need to see a human with it, and unfortunately we don't have one to see how startling, absolutely startling the differences are. What you would have with a normal human being is, you see these eye sockets, how shaved down and pulled down they are into a heart, kind of a teardrop shape. Well, normally this is squared off. You have brow ridges here. It would feel like a straw, like a drinking straw in your hand, but if you feel here, there's an edge. Totally different. No brow ridge whatsoever, and a brow ridge causes a dip in all of our noses right here. And if you see, there's no dip. There's no dip here at all. The eye sockets are incredibly shallow. If I put my finger in this one, as you see, it doesn't even come up to my first knuckle. See, it doesn't come up to my first knuckle. If I was putting my finger in a human eye socket, it would go past the second knuckle. It would go to here, where my thumb is. That's how deep, that's how different it is. There are no sinuses in here. Sinuses take up a huge amount of room in the head. No sinuses whatsoever. The eyeballs, as you see, if you can see down here, the little circle is the optic nerve opening, and the slit in here is the optic foramen, which is where the veins come in to feed the eyeball. If there is an eyeball in this head, and we assume that it is, although it probably is a lot smaller, or it sticks out, bulges out incredibly, it's going to be down here in the middle of the nose rather than up at the top bridge of the nose where we normally have an eye. But if you stick your fingers in here what you feel is, you can't see it. As you look at those eye sockets, you cannot see any difference in the terrain, and yet you stick your finger in here and you feel a slight dent. Your finger is sensitive enough to pick it up. Slight dent. You drag your finger here, you feel a rise in the bone, and then you feel another little dent. What those dents are attachments for muscles to move the eye. So we do think it had an eyeball for as bizarrely flattened and shallow as it is. The rear of the head, these are all the same parts. Frontal bone, 2 sphenoids, 2 temporals, 2 parietals, and an occipital, but completely reconfigured from the human norm, completely. And the bone itself, and this is key, the bone itself is no longer normal human bone. It's half as thin or half as thick, however you care to look at it. It weighs half as much. It's 40% as dense, and it's twice as hard. It doesn't look the same under a microscope. It doesn't look the same under a magnifying glass. And yet, it is bone. No doubt about it. It's not fossilized in any way. When the geneticists cut it out, nobody that's looked at it that knows anything about it says it's other than bone, a human bone skull, a human-like bone skull, except it's not human bone, really. It's something else.